Hi, everybody. It's World Penguin Day on Viking television. I'm Ron Naveen, the CEO of the nonprofit organization Oceanites. We're working really closely with Viking to share what we know about penguins in the natural world, and maybe even getting you excited about going south to see the seventh continent, the great seventh continent of ice and snow and penguins on a future trip you guys might take to the Antarctic. Today, what I'd like to do is tell you quite a bit about the work that we're doing at Oceanites, why it's important, and what messages the penguins are sending us about life on the planet and how we humans might be able to adapt in the future to a much warmer time. So here we go. Welcome to Penguins on World Penguin Day. What we do at Oceanites is count penguins literally so you don't have to. This picture is an old one, what I looked like about 35, 40 years ago when I first started doing it, and I'm still doing it, a little grayer in the whiskers than before. But the point is that the great seventh continent has captivated me immensely. I want it to captivate you as well. It's an incredible place where your mind lets go and you just start dreaming about better lives for all of us on the planet. And it's those penguins. Oh my God, look at the beautiful snow-capped peaks, late afternoon sun peeking through the clouds, lighting up the channel. I've done everything from work on tour ships and yachts to actually camping in the Antarctic over 40 years. And those penguins, oh my, they're heart-stopping little creatures. They remind us so much of ourselves because they stand upright. These three guys here are three of the 18 species of penguins that exist on the planet, 5 of which breed in the Antarctic. From left to right, we have the Gentoo Penguin, in the middle the chinstrap penguin, and on the right side the Adelie penguin. All of them are between 9 and 14 pounds in weight. They come up to about your kneecap if you're a regular sized human, and they make a lot of noise, they shuffle around, and we count them because understanding their population changes gives us a clue as to what's happening on the planet. Indeed, my Antarctic penguins are sending messages we shouldn't ignore. They are indeed sentinels of climate change. By understanding why their populations are changing and what the reasons are for such change, we can hypothesize what might be happening to us if we face a warmer future. That's why we count them. We count the nests in November and December, and in January and February count the number of chicks produced by each of the penguin species in the Antarctic Peninsula. So let me start today by telling you a bit about these penguins. Yes, they're birds. They don't fly, but they're birds. They're flightless. They're highly adapted because of their bullet shape to swim and dive. The 18 species are mostly found, almost exclusively found in the southern hemisphere. The one that occasionally gets north of the equator is the Galapagos penguin on one of its foraging trips, but they are truly southern hemisphere animals. Unlike the flying birds, penguins have very solid bones and short legs. They're built for swimming and diving. One amazing characteristic of the penguins is they have the densest feather arrangement of any bird, approximately 90 feathers per square inch. And they're counter-shaded, meaning dark on top, light below, so that when they swim in the water, predators can't see them from underneath, and they're protected while they go out and find fish and krill to eat. The penguins we study lay 1 or 2 eggs. They have a variable timing of breeding. They are relatively faithful to their mates, although some, like the emperor penguins, are more faithful than others. There's a strong site fidelity, meaning that for the Adelies, chin straps, and Gentoos that I study, they're certainly going to try to go back and breed on the same rocks they bred on the previous year. They're generally long-lived animals. In fact, the large emperor penguin, which gets up to about 4.5 feet tall, those emperors might live to 25 years or more. And there's a pretty high rate of adult survivorship. So let me tell you about the Adelies, chin straps, and Gentoos, which I know best. Long about late October or early November, the birds return from their winter offshore and go back to those stones on which they bred the previous year. And they do what's ecstatic displaying, calling out for their mates. Hopefully the female will return to the calling male within just a week or so, and the breeding season will begin once again. There are rocks from the previous year, but at this time of the season, we very frequently see the penguins going out and gathering stones and bringing them back to add on to the nest that they already have. And one of the things I like to point out with this slide, and we'll mention this a bit throughout the talk, you look at the rings around the nest, so to speak. Those are guano stains. The penguins generally incubate the eggs for about a month before they hatch, and they always face into the wind. So the guano, the excrement, is spewed out behind them. If it's white guano, we know they're eating fish. If it's pink guano, we know they're eating krill, which is the small crustacean that I like to call the power lunch of the Antarctic. It's very highly nutritious and the preferred prey item of penguins, crab-eater seals, and all the baleen whales. This is a chart of the food chain in the Antarctic. It looks quite complicated, but you'll see in the middle krill and fish fuel the Antarctic ecosystem. Everybody eats that power lunch called krill. And we're worried now in the vastly warmed Antarctic Peninsula just below South America that the krill stock has either diminished or moved. And that's why, as we'll explain in a minute, the Gentoo penguins are switching over more readily to eat fish to keep their families going. Some nice characteristics, you might say, about these penguins. They share in the parenting. Once the egg is laid, the male and female penguins share in the incubation of the egg, and once the chicks hatch out, both parents are involved in feeding the chicks for up to 4 to 6 more weeks until they fledge and go to sea at 8 weeks of age. Both the male and female penguins have what's called a brood pouch. It's the purplish area you see here, which is unfeathered and allows them to keep the eggs really warm during that month of incubation. There are predators to worry about. On land, the seagull-like birds called skuas will come in and steal eggs, maybe even steal and kill chicks. And eventually at 4 weeks, once the chicks get out from the nest and are fed up to a pretty good size, at 4 weeks they start assembling in large groups called creches, which offer some protection from the skuas. But then comes that point at 8 weeks of age when they've lost all their downy feathering. They try to go to sea, and then they have to face leopard seals, the main predator of penguins offshore. So there we are, my penguin counting team and I, with our handheld clickers, our pencils, and our notebooks, recording how many nests there are each year, and then later on how many chicks. We can compare from year to year the changes in the number of nests, and by dividing the number of chicks produced each season by the number of nests we record, we can figure out how productive the penguins have been. These penguins that I study, the Adelies, chinstraps, and Gentoos, lay 2 eggs. So if you get a productivity of 1.2 to 1.4, that's really fantastic. Very often it's less than 1. It could be as low as 0.6 or 0.8. So that's why we keep doing it. We want to know what changes are occurring, and if a change is detected, why it's happened. What we have found over all the years we've been working on the Antarctic Site Inventory Project, Gentoo numbers have increased rather markedly, while the numbers of Adelies and chinstrap penguins have declined. The question then is, why is that happening? And by trying to answer that question, why is that happening, we realize that the fate of the penguins is foretelling our own future. This is pretty dramatic. Over the last 6 decades in the Antarctic Peninsula, where I work just below South America, the winter temperature change in that region is a shockingly high 5 degrees centigrade or 9 degrees Fahrenheit. Year-round, that translates, or does it, year-round the change is plus 5 degrees Fahrenheit and 3 degrees centigrade. For those of you who follow all of the climate reports coming out of the UN, you know that there's a global effort trying to keep worldwide climate change down to 1.5 degrees centigrade. My goodness, the penguins in the Antarctic Peninsula have already experienced twice that change. So they're already dealing with twice the amount of feared change that we're going to have to potentially face in the future. And that's potentially why we're looking at penguins as the sentinels of climate change. What can we learn from the Gentoos, the Adelies, and the chinstraps about adapting to a much warmer life and lifestyle? I mean, after all, penguins are biological creatures just like we are. What happens to penguins might be a prediction of what might be happening to us. So as we look into a potentially warming future and worrying about what we can do about it, I, of course, hope that all of us humans are going to be like the Gentoos and going to do a good job of continuing to find food, have a good home, a healthy environment to live in, and keep producing kids and grandkids. Those are the 4 vitals that are key to any species, whether a penguin or a human, surviving into the future. I don't want to be like the Adelies and chinstraps, who are not adapting as well, it appears, to the warmed Antarctic Peninsula. We've got to jump into this together, all of us. And by focusing on the 4 vitals, I think it's a much more positive way of thinking what we humans can do to adapt to our warmer future. My goal in all of this outreach is to have more of us talking about the 4 vitals, about adaptation, about what we need to think about as we move forward. Climate change is here. Let's not argue about it anymore. Let's talk about what we can do to minimize it, and in terms of our own lives, how we can adapt to make it through what's going to be a warmer future for us. I repeat, if we can ensure those 4 vitals, we're going to make it. So let's look at the Gentoos and what they've done. I mentioned earlier that krill is the power lunch of the Antarctic, but if the krill stock has moved or declined, as appears to have happened in the Antarctic Peninsula, the Gentoos have much more readily switched over to a diet of fish. They don't swim as far offshore to find food, and they can dive deeper than the Adelies and the chinstraps. So on the food aspect, the Gentoos definitely seem to have adapted better to the warming conditions that they face. In terms of the homes that they have, the rock nests, the stone nests, Gentoos are increasing in number and it's getting crowded. But what we've recorded in our project is that the Gentoos are moving southward, ever southward, recolonizing or colonizing new places that they've never bred before and spreading themselves out. Wow, pretty cool. In terms of a healthy environment, well, the penguins at the moment don't have to worry like we worry about the COVID pandemic or other diseases, But who knows, in the future, maybe the penguins will have to face some kind of health emergency. At the moment, that's not an issue. And as mentioned earlier, we keep track of the numbers of chicks being produced. Because the gentoos can switch their diet, expand their breeding range, they can also keep producing chicks. One of the interesting things we're aware of is that if the gentoo pair loses its first set of 2 eggs, they can relay a second clutch and keep producing kids and grandkids. So again, the little bit of preaching I do, I guess, is that I want to be like a Gentoo penguin in the future. I want us humans to continue to have food to eat, a good home, a healthy environment, and keep producing kids and grandkids. It's a great way to talk about climate issues with your friends and family and others who may not agree with you. You don't have to be a preacher and say, oh, it's happening and whatever. Just make folks aware of the 4 vitals. It's a really great point to be discussing. Again, I want to be like those young baby gentoos dancing on the stones and bouncing into a very healthy future. And one question I get asked all the time, particularly by school kids, wow, can I have a penguin at home as a pet? Well, you can't actually do that. It's highly illegal, actually. But I'm not sure you'd want a krill or fish-eating penguin living around the house and spewing guano everywhere. What I like to say is what the penguins are teaching us, even if you can't have one as a pet, that it's really important to get out and know your outdoors. Get out to the woods or the parks in your neighborhood. Get to know the birds that live there and the other animals. By getting to know their lifestyles, you can really be talking about the 4 vitals all the time. Food, a good home, a good healthy environment, and keeping kids and grandkids coming. That's our message. For our future, for all of us, let's keep talking about penguins, about the 4 vitals, and making a difference. I want to be like a Gentoo penguin, and I want to adapt to a better and more wonderful future. Thanks so much.
Thank you, Ron. We've now got some questions which have come in from our audience. So I'm going to start with a question here from Gabrielle. She's in Ottawa, and she asks, do you have any idea why the gentoos are the ones who have been able to adapt better? What's different about them compared to the other penguin species?
That's a great question. As mentioned in the slideshow, we believe what's happening is the gentoos have switched their diet. They can, because they dive deeper and don't swim necessarily as far offshore from their nests to find food, they've switched over to more of a fish diet. They don't need to have krill. All these penguins would love to be eating krill. It's a very highly nutritious animal to be eating, but the krill stock has apparently shrunk or moved. And so the gentoos appear to be adapting very well to the change in the temperature in the peninsula by eating more fish. And as mentioned also in the slideshow, if the weather gets bad, they can relay their lost initial clutch of 2 eggs. And we're finding them moving their breeding colonies further south on both sides of the Antarctic Peninsula. So we think it's one of those 3 factors, changing their prey item, finding ways to get more homes further south, and continuing to produce kids. Last season in the Antarctic, interestingly, there was a lot of snow and rain. There's a lot more precipitation now in the warmer peninsula, and it was a very difficult year for all the penguins in the peninsula. But we'll be getting back in November and December this year, and hopefully we'll find things getting back to where they were numbers-wise a couple of years ago. Thanks for your question.
Thank you, Ron. An interesting question here from Scarlett in Cambridge, and she says, do you think there's a possibility that penguins might eventually evolve to use their wings and learn to fly in the future, so they'd be able to cover greater distances to find food or hunt for fish in different ways?
Oh, very good question. Penguins have been around for 20 or 30 million years or more and seem to keep adapting all the time. One question I actually get, it's a variation of this question, is what would happen if polar bears were introduced into the Antarctic? And my joking response is that penguins would probably learn how to fly again pretty quickly. Evolution takes millions of years to happen. That's a possibility that as we go on well into the future, well past our time on the planet, penguins will evolve to fly. But they don't need to right now. All of the Earth's land masses used to be together in the big supercontinent of Gondwana. And when that split in two, the part that went north is where all the land-based predators evolved, like bears and foxes. But to the south, no land predators, and that caused the penguins to not need to fly like their neighbors well to the north. If you see puffins or murres or guillemots to the north, they're the flying relatives of the penguins to the south. So who knows, maybe in a million years, those penguins will start flying again.
Thank you, Ron. A question here now from Katrina in Palm Beach. She asks, why have no penguin species ever colonized the Arctic?
They probably have not colonized the Arctic, at least at the moment, because of all the land-based predators, is what I would guess. Again, as mentioned in my last answer, the evolution to the north in the northern hemisphere involved a lot of land-based predators. If there were no foxes, polar bears, and other land-based predators in the north, we probably would find penguins in our backyard, but we don't have that situation.
Thank you. Next question is from Timothy in Brookville, and he says, how do the penguins respond to humans when you are counting them? Are they generally afraid of people, or does the human presence not seem to bother them?
That's a really good question. We're very careful as researchers not to bother the penguins. And much like everybody in the tourist community who keeps a safe distance away from the penguins, we all realize that the penguins basically are a foot and a half, 2 feet tall, or maybe in the case of an emperor, 4 feet tall. But most of us humans are well above 5 feet. And so you have to take a lot of care in approaching them, whether as a visitor or as a researcher. We're very careful when we're out counting penguins to move slowly. And if you happen to kneel down or sit down, all of a sudden you're about as tall as a penguin is. And I've had the great, wonderful experience of sitting down and just watching penguins go about their business. And I've had penguins actually crawl into my lap for a while. Didn't last very long, but it proved to me, of course, that if you get down to their height level, they're going to be a lot less afraid of you than they normally would be.
Thank you, Ron. You might have just touched on this with your last answer, but we have Jennifer in Lansing in the United States, and she says, thank you for your work. I'm sure you have hundreds of great stories, but what has been your most memorable or favourite penguin encounter?
Oh, there's so many of them. The one I just mentioned is a favorite, having that little baby penguin jump into my lap. There was a 5-year period from 2003 to 2008 when my team camped at a location called Peterman Island in the southern part of the Antarctic Peninsula. And we actually were tenting and camping on site for 5 years. And there were many encounters at that time that I will never forget. They're quite indelible. For example, there's nothing better then unzipping your tent in the morning, your little pup tent, to go get some coffee in the office tent, and to find a Gentoo penguin or a Delhi penguin just standing right in front of the opening to your tent, and you just go face to face with the penguin. It's pretty incredible. There were also some warm, I'll mention one other one. Occasionally we would have a very warm day, or maybe it would get up to about 10 degrees C or 50 degrees Fahrenheit. And we had a little portable gas grill. We would cook some chicken or something on it for dinner, but just to be outside and in the fresh air. And it wouldn't be surprising to have a number of penguins come over and actually stand with us watching the fire and watching. We wouldn't, of course, feed them any chicken or anything like that. But they're incredibly curious animals. And this might be a good moment to mention that the penguins, if you want to really get anthropomorphic, have their own little human-like characteristics. The chinstrap penguins will run right up to you and scream and yell right away as if, my God, you got to show them your passport or driver's license right away. The Adelie penguins are also pretty aggressive. They will do some low growling and start stabbing at you with their beaks, which is why it's always good when you go out to do some penguin counting to wear a pair of glasses and to wear some rain pants, because you might get bitten by a penguin. But the one that's the gentlest of all is the Gentoo penguin. They will move their head left and right, come inspect you, nibble at your boots. So I guess from spending too much time with the penguins, I actually think they are like little people. They're really quite amazing animals. So I could probably go on for a couple hours with stories, but we'll leave it at that for the moment.
Wonderful. Thank you, Ron. Question now here from Carly in Birmingham. And she says, so how do you actually count the penguins? How do you make sure you don't lose count or that you double count the same penguin twice?
That's a great question. And I can show you my clicker, my faithful handheld clicker. The way to do this is to be careful. And I've gotten really good at it. Our protocol for our research project is to count each group of penguins 3 times until you get 3 or more times until you get 3 counts within 5% of one another. That's easy to do with a group of 10 penguins, but what if you have a group of 50, 75, or 100? The key to this is to walk a straight line in one direction and to keep track of what you've counted already, maybe on one side of your hand or the other. And you keep walking that straight line back and forth carefully, and with one hand doing the clicking and the other hand keeping track of what you've already counted. And you actually can get very, very good at this after a while. I'm very, very good now at counting groups of up to a couple hundred or more. But we also encounter large groups of penguins that are impossible in a short period of time to count by that clicking method. And the latest innovations that are happily helping us out here, either using satellite photos or photos from drones, unmanned aerial vehicles, that you can take back and count those photographs or videos off of your computer screen. So it's really, really important to count carefully, not double count. And again, want to repeat, as I mentioned in the slideshow, that the important counts are the nest counts in November and December, and then the chick counts in January and February. And by comparing the nest counts from year to year, we know whether populations are rising or falling. Our latest data show that the trends that we mentioned in the slideshow, Gentoo's up and the Adelies and chinstraps down in the Antarctic Peninsula, that trend is still continuing.
Thank you, Ron. A question here now from Amelia in Stevenage, and she asks, how many penguins on average would you count in a day? And how many do you count in a total season?
Oh, God. Hundreds of thousands in a season if you add in all the photographs, the digital photographs from drones or satellite photos that we utilize. I guess one example to mention to you is you can find a movie about our project called The Penguin Counter, certainly available on Amazon and Apple. You can find it pretty easily. But that details work we did a number of years ago at an island called Deception Island. And there's one colony there called Bailey Head, which was reputed to have in the past up to 75,000 or 100,000 pairs of chinstrap penguins. It took us literally 3 days to count that colony, and it turned out that the numbers were way down, just above 50,000 nests. But it does take a while to count large groups of penguins. I'd have to do some rough calculations offline to let you know how many penguins I've counted in a season, but I've undoubtedly counted many hundreds of thousands of them.
Thank you. A question here from Adria, I think in San Marcos in the United States, and she says, what happens if a predator like a mega killer whale comes to eat some penguins? Has that ever happened while you've been there?
Have I ever seen predation? Yes. Some of it is quite horrific to see, actually. As mentioned in the slideshow, on land, the predators to worry about are these seagull-like birds called skuas. They will come in and try to just work in a pair of skuas working together, stealing one or both eggs from an unsuspecting or suspecting pair of penguins. But the worst of it is when the chicks hatch out and finally are large enough to get out from under the brood pouch of the parents, skuas could come in and literally pick one off and pull it apart. It's a pretty gruesome thing to see. Equally as gruesome, at 8 weeks of age, when the chicks are ready to fledge and go to sea, the main predator to worry about is the leopard seal. And leopard seals will grab a penguin and literally shake it out of its skin. It's a very bloody mess. So it's the cycle of life in the Antarctic, and I've seen a lot of predation. Pretty gruesome to see, but it does happen pretty regularly.
Thank you, Ron. A question now from Rose in New York, and she asks, do you study penguin populations in other locations, such as South Africa, Australia, or New Zealand?
I do not. Our project does not study penguins in other locations, but we do keep in touch with a lot of colleagues working on penguin studies in other places. And that's really key and important because there are other issues facing penguins. There are issues facing penguins around the world. Perhaps most notably, the penguins around both coasts of South America are having difficulties now numbers-wise because of overfishing in the region. Same thing with the African penguins. So no, our project does not study other than Antarctic penguins, but we do keep in touch with other researchers who are doing so.
Thank you. David in Orlando asks, do different species of penguin cooperatively interact with one another?
Well, not necessarily. At Peterman Island, where we camped, for example, there were breeding Gentoo penguins and breeding Adelie penguins. And the Gentoo penguins are, to say the least, bigger and a little more aggressive in terms of taking over nests that the other smaller species may have initially begun. They generally keep to themselves, although there are mixed colonies with 2 and occasionally 3 species breeding together, but they tend to keep to themselves. There's a lot of interaction just within one species itself. For example, at Peterman, there may be a sub-colony of many hundred Gentoo penguins. And for one penguin in the middle of that colony, just to get out to go to sea to find food or bring food back, would have to run the gauntlet of all the other penguins. They are very protective of their nests and their eggs and their chicks, and so they're not going to care for any intrusion, whether it's a human getting too close or another penguin. They're pretty protective of their space.
Thank you. A question now from Connie in the United States, and she says, how is the leopard seal population doing, and would a significant increase or decrease in leopard seals impact the penguin population?
I'm not aware of leopard seal numbers. That's something I just don't know. Leopard seals do patrol offshore, and presumably you would think the more leopard seals there are, the more predation there would be. But it's unclear. I just have to honestly say it's unclear to me what level of effect the amount of leopard seal predation is having on the penguin population. I am not sure at all that it is having a significant impact. It's an interesting question. I'd have to get more information about that.
Sure, thank you, Ron. A question here from Ryder in Arizona, United States, and he says, do most penguins mate for life?
There's a very high divorce rate amongst the penguins that I study. I can't remember precisely the numbers, but I believe, if I recall at least semi-correctly, the Gentoo penguins have the lower rate of divorce, but there's a high turnover. I have seen it, I guess chinstrap penguin colonies are the best example. The male penguin is normally the one that comes back to the nest stones that he used the previous year. The mates do not stay together during the off season, so the male comes back, starts displaying on near the stones that were his nest from the previous year, and is expecting the female, the mate from the previous year, to come back, within a week or 10 days. If that mate does not come back, he will mate with any available female that comes along. And you sometimes see these battles royale where I think what has happened is the male has come back, his old mate does not show up, he mates with a new female, then the original wife comes home and there's a lot of tension and he's got a lot of explaining to do, as we might say.
Thank you, Ron. A question here from Alan in the United States, and he says, do you know, is South Georgia Island still rodent free? And has this effort to eradicate rodents been extended to any other islands around Antarctica?
The rodent extermination program at South Georgia has been, for the most part, highly successful, as I understand it. But I am not aware of any of those kinds of activities in the Antarctic, nor am I aware that any place in the Antarctic is suffering the introduced rodent problem that existed at South Georgia because of the whaling stations. But to answer the first part of that question, I do think it's been highly successful.
Thank you. Quick question here from Sam in the United States, and he says, do penguins ever adopt orphaned chicks?
Do penguins adopt others' chicks? I have heard stories that is the case, that they will, if a chick happens to wander away from its nest, it may wind up getting fed by another pair of penguins that are not its own parents. We have encountered, more particularly with gentoos, which usually lay 2 eggs, nests that have 3 and maybe even 4 chicks. And you kind of wonder whether what happened was eggs from another nest rolling down into that one nest, expanding the number from 2 to 4, or whether chicks might have gotten adopted. I think what's more likely to happen is that they are nesting pretty close together. There could be a disruption that moves an egg out of the nest and it gets pulled in by another penguin on another nest. So maybe adoption, but certainly taking over somebody else's egg, that does happen.
Thank you. Marjorie in Walnut Creek in the United States, she asked, can any Antarctic penguin species be raised successfully in a human-controlled environment, such as a zoo?
Yes, there's a lot of... One question I get all the time is, I want to see a penguin in my own backyard. There are many zoos in the United States that have penguins and are successfully raising Antarctic penguins. This all began back with SeaWorld many decades ago, but you can find emperor penguins in captivity. You certainly can find gentoos in captivity and chinstraps in captivity. So wherever you're located, just check out your local zoo and see whether they've got penguins. There are many places, many zoos and aquaria in the United States where you can find penguins, and in the UK as well, of course.
Thank you. Just a fun question here, which has come in from a few different people, Jennifer and Miki. They'd both like to know where you got your hat from and whether they could purchase one.
I got my hat to give to my penguin counting colleagues. At some point, we're going to produce these and hopefully begin to sell them. But it does show the 4 of the 5 penguins that we do count: the macaroni, the chinstrap, the deli, and Gentoo. Hopefully, just keep going to www.oceanites.org, our website, and we'll hopefully let you know when these are available to the general public. Not yet, though.
Wonderful, thank you. A question here from Harry, I think in the United States, and he says, has Oceanites created any educational materials for young children?
It's a great question. The answer is yes. If you go to the Oceanites website, you'll be able to download our series of children's educational books about penguins, penguin counting, and climate change. And one other thing that we're doing, in addition to providing these free ebooks for kids, we love doing webinars with children. And if you just get in touch with us and our development director, David Lippy, all that contact information is on our website. We'll be happy to arrange a talk. And maybe once COVID goes away, even a personal appearance at your local school or with your educational group. We're known to go out and talk to everybody we can talk to. Makes no difference what age, what political persuasion. We want to tell the story of our penguins, why we all should be gentoos, and go from there. So we're happy to do that.
Thank you. I think that's pretty much all we've got time for. So we'll just finish on quite a big question. This one's from Wendy in the United States. And she says, what can the average person do in their day-to-day life to help penguins and ensure their endurance for future generations?
That is a great question. I mentioned earlier that a lot of people would love to have a penguin, but they can't. They've got to do the best they can to go to their zoos, to talk with friends, think about the 4 vitals. I think what's most important about saving penguins or conserving penguins right now is telling their story. The story of the 4 vitals and how penguins, like us humans, need food, a good home, a good environment, and keep producing kids and grandkids. The more and more that you all can get out and tell friends about that and talk up climate change and get them interested in it is great. But I also think this leads to something that I haven't shared yet, but I will now. I think the reason I'm, after all these years, still counting penguins is because when I was a kid growing up in northeastern Pennsylvania at a very young age, about 14, I became a pretty fanatical bird watcher. I got out in the woods. I got to know the animals, the birds, the trees, the flowers. I would encourage everyone to not only think about the penguin's lifestyle and the four vitals, but to get out into your own neighborhood, your own woods and parks, get to know the animals and the environment. It'll be something that you love. And if it's something that you love, you're going to want to take care of it in the future. And you're going to want to get other people involved in that. Once you do that, you can keep spreading the word. You might get involved in political activity. That's all up to you. I think the best way forward is to have a much broader conversation about climate change, using penguins as the avatar to talk about that. That's going to ultimately make a difference. It's going to take many years to get this done, but we're making small steps and making small progressive steps forward. And I got my fingers crossed that ultimately we are going to survive, we humans, and so will our penguins. Get outside, put down those cell phones, get to know your animals in your backyard.
That's wonderful. Thank you so much for your time, Ron, and thank you for answering so many of our viewers' questions.
Great, I really appreciate it. And if I could, I'd like to take a moment just again to remind everyone that if you go to the Oceanites website, you can get all kinds of information about our children's ebooks, about signing up for a webinar or a Zoom call with me or one of my colleagues. I'd also like to thank Viking for making this appearance possible, and as well thank our other sponsors who have helped us with a big social media outreach today, EBI International, Marathon Tours, and Ogline Digital. They've been great. And also want to mention, if you go to our website, we have a wonderful photographer from Australia, Kelly Edwards, who's selling NFTs, digital photographs of Gentoo penguins. And you can help support Oceanites by getting in touch with Kelly. The link is on our website, and figure out how to participate. We'd be grateful for that. Thank you so much. I appreciate everybody staying in touch. And if you have further questions, please get in touch with us through our website, and we'll try the best we can to answer them. Thanks so much.